And we're on WBAI. It's 2:08 on this July 16th, 1998. Pleasure being with you, Shelton Walden, here on Walden's Pond. Well, my guest this afternoon is Mark Jenkins. Mark Jenkins is the investigative editor for Men's Health magazine, formerly the Rocky Mountain editor for Backpacker. He now works for Men's Health, and he's written a cover story in the August 1998 edition entitled, "Did Circumcision Ruin Your Sex Life?" as a cover story this month. And in the preface, circumcision is the most common operation performed in America. It also robs men of their full potential for sexual pleasure, puts baby boys at unnecessary risk for dangerous complications, and costs $400 million a year. Almost all the reasons for circumcision are based in myth, Mr. Jenkins said. And even doctors admit that it isn't medically necessary, but every year over 1 million boys are circumcised. And he's written this article, complete with pictures, in the current issue of Men's Health magazine. I welcome him here on WBAI. Thank you very much for being here.
Thanks, Shelton. Happy to be here.
You're welcome. And thank you for being here in the studio. You're here all the way from Wyoming. Also, I want to alert the audience that Mr. Jenkins is also the author of a relatively new book entitled To Timbuktu, A Journey Down the Niger River in Africa. And of course, his work has appeared in many publications, including GQ, Playboy, and Reader's Digest magazine. We'll be talking a little bit about that book as well, and some of the interesting adventures you had in Africa, and as it relates to this issue of circumcision. This article actually is one of the first articles of this type to appear in what you would call a mainstream publication.
That's true.
Tell us about it, and what is the genesis of this piece?
Actually, I saw circumcision as an issue for many years, both male and female circumcision. And having lived and worked in Africa over the years, it came to my attention that it's a very common procedure in America. In fact, once I started doing the research, it turns out that circumcision is the most common operation performed in America. And so I suggested the story to Men's Health, and I said, I'll go into it without a pro or a con position. I'll just research it. And they whatever I come out with, I'm going to write it. And they went for that.
Very good. We've, of course, on this program, we've talked about this issue many times here. We've looked at it from the legal, the medical, cultural aspects of this procedure. This particular issue, this particular article, and the way the magazine did it, it's very graphic. It doesn't pull any punches, particularly
doesn't pull any punches.
Not at all.
Shelton.
This is the first time I've seen pictures like this in a major publication showing the baby on the circumstraint being circumcised. And the question in the article is it necessary? And just tell us what are some of the things that you found in the course of researching this?
Well, let me first address the pictures. We talked a lot about that because they are very graphic, but then
extremely graphic.
Yeah, the way the story is written is that I said, okay, if I'm going to write this story, I want there to be a story in there where I actually describe what happens when a child is circumcised. Most parents do not see this operation. The child is taken away, circumcised, and brought back. So they have no idea what's going on. Secondly, most circumcisions in America are still performed without anesthetic. So parents really often don't know what's going on. In fact, in my research, I found that 65% of parents don't really know. They know very little about circumcision. It's just a customary thing. Your kid disappears, comes back screaming, screams for 2 or 3 days, and they don't know what's happening. What did I find out?
Yeah.
I started with circumcision to find out the genesis of it. Now, outside the religious community, outside the Jewish faith, of course, Abraham was ordered by God to circumcise himself and his son.
And the Muslim faith as well.
Yes, as well. But in the secular community, circumcision was basically unheard of in America until 1870. And that's when a doctor named Dr. Sayre claimed to have performed a circumcision that cured a young boy of epilepsy. And he subsequently went on to say that circumcision could cure all sorts of things: backaches, elephantitis, typhoid. And so the first 30 years of circumcision in America outside the religious community was done kind of as a systemic cure for all sorts of ailments. By the 19th century, turn of the century that is, it was quite clear that circumcision was not curing any of these these ailments. But that was also just at the height of the kind of Victorian craze, and what happened is the reasonings for circumcision actually got transmuted and became a way to stop young boys from masturbating, and that stuck around for a long time. That lasted from about the turn of the century. That reasoning lasted for almost 50 years, until about World War II. After World War II, it was quite clear that circumcision was not stopping young men from masturbating. And then the next excuse, in fact, I even had a doctor who said that circumcision was basically a procedure looking for a rationale. In the late, kind of in the 50s, there was the hygiene argument that an uncircumcised penis was less clean. And I did a lot of homework on that, and that turns out to be perhaps racially, comes from a racial
How so?
attitude. During the 40s and 50s, white middle-class Americans, males, were mostly born in hospitals. During that period, a lot of immigrants, a lot of black African Americans were not born in hospitals. If you're not born in a hospital, you're not circumcised. So the whole issue became kind of subterfuge, sort of a very subtle racial issue. And it wasn't until the 70s where it was clear there wasn't a hygiene issue, it wasn't masturbation, it wasn't going to cure epilepsy, that some doctors began to claim that it would cure penile cancer, even cervical cancer. Well, I went through all the journals around the world, medical journals, and found that that's not true either. So in the end, it turns out the circumcision, outside the religious reasoning, it's not based on any medical facts at all. It was a cultural procedure, not unlike, in many ways, the cultural practice of female circumcision in West Africa.
Yeah, which you encountered when you were over there during your travels. A lot of the audience has heard a lot of this before. What I found particularly interesting, well, first, the cover story is, and Men's Health, of course, is geared to men who are active, who are engaged in relationships with women, and a lot of the articles tend to focus on how to improve your sex life, relationships, etc. The title of this circumcision ruin your sex life is extremely
it can scare you.
It can scare you.
Yeah,
Exactly. It's
exactly.
a very volatile statement. In the course of your research for the magazine, does this answer the question that you posed?
You'd hate to look at probably 80% of American men are circumcised and say that their sex life is ruined. I don't think it's ruined, but I did find in my research that you are losing something valuable. Some doctors say that you lose up to one half of the penile skin during a circumcision, and that skin is sexually erotic tissue, and you lose that. You also lose, according to Dr. John Taylor, who's a pathologist up in Canada, you lose 240 feet of nerves in your foreskin, and those nerves, they're erotic tissue. So you are losing something. How much you lose? The only way you really know that is, and I did do this, is interview men who were circumcised as adults after they'd had sex. And invariably they claim that sex is not as enjoyable after being circumcised.
That's what they claim. I've heard that, and I tend to agree. But there are men out here who say, just to play devil's advocate, there's a lot of men who, when asked this question, will say, "Well, it hasn't affected my sex life," and they think this is no big deal. That there's a lot of people who will say that this is a case of a lot of men whining and pining over something that is just nondescript and it's ethereal. That how do you know?
I don't think you can know, and it's certainly you can't look back. Most American men were circumcised, and they can't look back, and they have the sex life that they have, and they can prove that through other ways. Although there are men who are trying to regain their foreskin. You might have heard of this.
Yes, the restoration movement.
The restoration movement, and I don't know if that's really necessary. I would not jump to conclusions that if you have problems in your marriage or your relationship, the sexual problems, that it's due to circumcision. The point really is this a necessary medical procedure? Okay. If it's not, why is it done? And that's what I was looking into.
Right. There's one doctor in particular says that removing the foreskin from the penis is equivalent to removing the appendix from inside the body. That is unnecessary.
Yeah. The pro-circumcision people claim that there is no loss that's of sexually erotic tissue, but it seems when you look at when the pathologists have looked at the foreskin, they've not found that to be true. They've found that there really are a lot of nerves. There's something like 1,000 nerve endings in the foreskin that are lopped off. I know that there's been a lot of argument back and forth in this country about circumcision, but in my research, and I covered the globe on all the medical journals, there was no definitive medical evidence that this procedure is helpful. And we would never we don't do unnecessary surgeries in this country. You just don't do them.
Right.
I had one doctor say that, well, look at, even if it's true that uncircumcised boys may have a higher risk of penile cancer, which is not true, even if that were true, because that's one of the pro-circumcision arguments,
Right.
the rate of breast cancer in women is 10 to 100-fold the rate of penile cancer in men, but no one would consider lopping off a woman's breast when she's 12 years old.
Exactly.
So it's an unnecessary
Although
surgery.
there has been some some doctors who have suggested that in order to prevent breast cancer, that some women have
predisposition,
right,
heredity.
Right, heredity, with that they should have a mastectomy.
Right. Yeah, that's a very radical procedure that only if you're basically 90%, 100% sure that you will get breast cancer should that be done. And that's just not true with men. Even the general population, penile cancer is less than 1% of the population, and it only occurs in older men. The interesting thing about the penile cancer argument, Sheldon, is that you find that penile cancer rates are higher in America than they are in other countries that do not circumcise their children. For instance, we have about twice the penile cancer rate here in America, where most people are circumcised, than in Northern Europe, for instance, Scandinavia, Norway, Sweden, Finland. And they do not circumcise any of their children. In fact, this is another thing that most Americans your listeners probably know, but 85 to 90% of the world's men are not circumcised. America is one of the last countries that's still performing this procedure. Canada and Australia, the circumcision rate has been dropping dramatically. And on the west coast of America, circumcision is dropping dramatically. So I think it's a historical anomaly, and I think it will disappear outside the religious community.
You talk with Dr. Ronald Goldman, who is the author of several books, including Circumcision, The Hidden Trauma, and he says that circumcision, there's a lot of hidden rage and hidden trauma as a result of circumcision in this culture. Do you think, can you guess, make a somewhat of a supposition that a lot of the violence, maybe some problems in relationships, rage, trauma as a result of circumcision that spilled into relationships?
That's again, a cause and effect thing is very hard to speculate. I will say, however, that the old argument that one of the arguments used for circumcision by doctors and nurses for many, many years. In fact, I heard this argument from a nurse while I was witnessing a circumcision. The child's brought in, put on the circumstraint, and then the procedure begins. And it is not too bloody of a procedure, but it's obviously very painful. The child's screaming and screaming. About midway through the procedure, the child completely stopped screaming. And the nurse turned to me and said, well, look, I told you that it's not that big a deal. Kids don't feel the same kind of pain that we feel. Well, I looked into that issue. It turns out that what's really happened is that child has gone into shock. That's why they stop screaming. It's not because they don't feel anything. And it only makes sense. Anybody who's a parent, and I'm a parent, and if you have children, you see that they feel everything every adult feels. And of course, pathologists have now proven that in fact the skin on the penis is probably some of the most sensitive skin on the body. So the whole argument that they don't feel pain It's not true. They feel enormous amount of pain. And some people do believe. I interviewed a doctor named Dr. James Prescott, PhD of Institute of Humanistic Studies. And he claims that circumcision causes such traumatic pain in newborns that it may have damaging, lasting, detrimental effects into our society. I'm not sure about that, but that would be very difficult to prove medically. And what I looked at was primarily the medical facts.
I was talking with a parent yesterday about this issue, and they were talking about a conversation they had with a neighbor of theirs, and their son was circumcised at 3.5 years old, and they took the child in for a routine examination, and they said that the child needed a circumcision because he was in risk of getting a urinary tract infection.
Right.
And they did the circumcision, and the boy was afterwards was in pain, was crying, bleeding, etc. And it was very traumatic to see this boy like that. And they're wondering if they're going to
did the right thing.
Did the right thing.
Well, most people take the counsel of their physician.
Right.
And there is some evidence to show that there's a very, very slight increase in the probability of UTI infection if you're uncircumcised. Even that evidence, though, is counterbalanced with other evidence that shows that there may be a higher rate of other forms of infection. As you know, once oftentimes circumcision is done when the baby's less than 24 hours old.
Right.
Then the child obviously is brought back to his mother, and then children wet their pants constantly. So you've got this urine on an open wound.
Okay.
You got feces on an open wound. So there are other infections that can happen that the studies aren't all finished on this, but my guess is that when all of it comes out, that you'll have a higher rate of infection and other forms of infection, even if you do have a higher rate of UTI in uncircumcised boys. It'll all cancel out, and it'll still prove, which I do believe, it's an unnecessary operation.
Do you think, in the course of your research, that it causes a greater incidence of sexually transmitted diseases?
No, that was another argument that was used in favor of it. I think it was a cultural thing, a very, very deep-seated, and it's also only in the last 20 or 30 years have people kind of openly talked about sexual issues, and particularly for male sexual issues.
Exactly.
Women have been talking among themselves for a long time about sex. Men have not.
Right.
In fact, Men's Health is a magazine that has brought that to the fore and said, listen, we can talk about these issues and try to solve some of them.
Yes.
And even when I was a younger man, these were just not issues anyone talked about.
That's true. I mean, the discussion like circumcision is something that was very rarely discussed in open media or in conversations, even with just having a conversation about it.
It was a taboo subject.
It's a very taboo subject.
Yeah. What we're seeing now is that more and more people are speaking out against this, and we're also finding that one of the arguments I heard from a doctor was that, okay, it's not medically necessary, but it's kind of socially necessary. And I said, why? Well, when a boy's 13, 14, he's going to be in the locker room, he's going to look different than other kids. So I said, okay, I took each one of the arguments and tried to demythologize it and take it apart and see if it really works. And I talked to one editor who was circumcised. He did not circumcise his boys. And he had a great answer for that, I thought. He said, do you remember when you were 13? You were teased for everything. Didn't matter. It was if you were fat, you were teased. If you were skinny, you were teased. If you had red hair, if you had no hair, it didn't matter. And so the whole issue of they'll be kind of embarrassed everybody's embarrassed in junior high.
Oh, sure.
That's the age. That's what's going to happen.
Absolutely.
And the other kind of statistical interesting thing about the issue, the kind of argument that you want your kid to look like all the other kids, is he won't. In Southern California now, the rate of circumcision is down to 35%. 65% of those boys born are not circumcised. So the whole locker room, he'll feel uncomfortable argument kind of falls apart completely because if you have a child right now, if a child was born today, probably by that time that boy is in junior high school, the kind of embarrassment age, whatever, I would guess that in many parts of the country, half the boys will not be circumcised already. it's not going to become an issue. Another 10 or 20 years outside the religious community, this will not be an issue. It won't be done.
Yeah. Very, very interesting. It's 2:27 here on WBAI, listener-sponsored community radio. We're talking with Mark Jenkins. He's the field editor for Men's Health magazine. The August 1998 edition of the magazine has a cover story entitled "Did Circumcision Ruin Your Sex Life?" And we're talking about the American phenomenon of circumcision, which is the removal of the foreskin from a male penis. Of course, this issue is getting more attention in the last several years. There's been a lot of talk about female genital mutilation or female circumcision, which there is now a law in this country. There's been in the article you talked about some of the legal cases that have been brought against hospitals for this. Just describe some of those cases. I mean, it seems to be increasing on some level. There's been some botched circumcisions. Also, I want to also point out a very notorious case of a botched circumcision was the John Jones case, which took place over 35 years ago, where a boy was doing a botched circumcision, had to have his penis amputated, and was raised as a girl ostensibly until his adolescence, and then he rebelled, and then they finally told him the story of what happened. It was a very sad story. But tell some of the cases that.
You've got every year. I mean, first of all, you have to remember that over 1 million baby boys are circumcised a year in this country.
It's the most common operation.
It's the most common. So every minute a boy is circumcised. With that number of circumcisions, you are going to have a statistical error, and you do have that. You have a case every year. You have cases of little boys having more than the skin cut off, the glands themselves cut off. There are cases of half of the penis being removed, or the penis being cut so severely that it has to be reattached. Those are all gruesome examples that really don't make it into the statistics. Okay, so you have a 10% or a 1% increased likelihood of UTIs, but what's the likelihood of having some other infection, or what's the likelihood of injury, particularly since it's an unnecessary operation?
Yes.
The attorneys are also getting involved in this, and I think partly what's changing in our culture is people are asking questions about the medical procedures that are performed on them. They are asking questions, not only on them, but on their children. And this is something that's, doctors had a kind of a status for so long in our culture where people wouldn't even ask questions.
Doctors as priests.
Yeah, exactly. And now what we have, a lot of people are becoming more educated. They're reading magazines, they're reading books. There's a lot of books out there on medical procedures that are unnecessary or some other form of treatment, and people are asking questions and saying, is this necessary? Do I need to do this? Does this actually injure my future?
Yes.
And that's circumcision falls right into that.
Yeah. One person who we had on this program some months ago, Dr. Margaret Somerville, she's the founding director of at McGill University of the Center for Medicine, Ethics, and Law. She said she declared circumcision, quote, technically criminal assault.
Right.
And that because the child essentially has not consented to this at all, and is strapped down against their will. What do you think about that? Do you think that it could be considered assault?
I think, yes, I do. I think I consider it assault. I don't think that you'll see that on the books anytime soon.
Okay.
But I do think that her position is very important, because what it's saying to doctors is, listen, you are performing something that's unnecessary and it does harm the child. If there's not, as she says, if there's not therapeutic intent, then circumcision becomes an unjustified wounding, and I agree with her completely. Therefore, I think doctors are going to begin to think twice about performing this surgery routinely, particularly when they don't fully inform the parents, because it's just a malpractice suit waiting to happen, particularly if they don't say enough to the parents about what this procedure really is, what happens, whether they use anesthetic, whether they don't use anesthetic, and what the long-term consequences of being circumcised really are. And most doctors don't take that time.
Yes.
Even the pro-circumcision doctors admit that circumcision should be fully explained to the parents, and that's not happening.
That's not happening at all now.
No. In fact, you can talk to a lot of parents who just even the woman may still be groggy. She still may be kind of recovering from the birth itself, and the child's taken away and comes back circumcised.
Yes.
That's still very common.
That's right. And they may have signed something. They don't know what they have signed.
Sure. They may rush into the hospital. You sign lots of things when you go into a hospital.
right,
You sign
that's
15, 20 different forms. You don't know what you've signed. Most of the time, you're just trying to make sure it all ends up on insurance anyway.
Right, exactly.
And I think we're in the process of change in this country in terms of circumcision.
Yeah, and changing general body awareness about issues and the whole issue about a patient's bill of rights, which is gaining more credence and more currency in the country. The two political parties are fighting over this with the HMOs, the health maintenance organizations, about this. So maybe there will be some good to come out of this.
Well, Shelton, there's an interesting point about HMOs and insurance with regard to circumcision. Is in England, circumcision before World War II, the circumcision rates in England and in America were roughly the same, very high. In the 80s. After World War II, they have socialized medicine, and they had a task force that looked at circumcision in England and decided that they could not prove medical necessity for circumcision. Therefore, circumcision was not covered, was not a covered operation in their social health care system. What do you think happened? Within about 20 years, the circumcision rate dropped from 75, 80% down to less than 1%.
Wow.
When it wasn't paid for, it wasn't performed. And I think that that's another component. I don't think it's the biggest component. I think the biggest component is social.
Yeah.
But when insurance companies stop paying for circumcision, doctors will stop doing it.
Okay. Well, that may be the cure. Maybe one of the cures for it here in this country. Shelton Walden here on Walden's Pond. It's 2:34 here on WBAI 99.5 FM. We're talking with Mark Jenkins, the field editor and investigative editor of Men's Health magazine. He's the author of the cover story, the August 1988 edition, looking at a very up until now taboo subject. Did circumcision ruin your sex life? We're looking at the issue of male circumcision in the United States, right here in North America. We'll be taking your phone calls at for Mark Jenkins at 212-279-3400, 212. Oh, my goodness. No. The number to call is 209-2900, 212-209-2900. Yes, please don't call that number. That number may be some poor soul who get a lot of calls. The number to call, we've moved, by the way, Mark, we moved here to 120 Wall Street. The number to call here is 212-209-2900, 209-2900, okay? That's the number to call for on air if you wish to talk with Mark Jenkins and me, Shelton Walden. Also, we'll be talking a little bit after the break about Mark's journeys in Africa and his encounter looking at the issue of female circumcision. So stay with us. We'll be right back with more of Walden's Pond right here on WBAI 99.5 FM in New York. Adiamas, Songs of Sanctuary. Shelton Walden here. Walden's Pond is the program, 2:38 on this July 16th, 1998. Hot day in New York City, hot outside. There's a bomb threat outside the building here at 120 Wall Street, right here on Wall Street. It's a lot of police and fire activity, but we are in the building safe and sound, okay? Shelton Walden with my guest, Mark Jenkins. He is the field editor and investigative editor of Men's Health magazine, August 1998 edition. We're talking about circumcision. The cover story for that issue is Did Circumcision Ruin Your Sex Life? Very volatile lead there. Of course, the issue we've covered here on Walden's Pond many times, looking at various aspects of this and how it affects men and women and helping us to become healthier human beings. Also, Mark Jenkins is also the author of To Timbuktu, A Journey Down the Niger River. And very briefly, that book was published last year, right?
Yes, it was.
And very briefly, what was that? What is the book about?
Actually, the book's a lot about friendship. I grew up with a good friend of mine in Wyoming, and we often did expeditions together. And this is a story about an expedition we did in West Africa. We were the first to kayak the headwaters of the Niger River. And we left high school early and took off and ended up in Africa, and we were trying to get to Timbuktu at that time. and didn't make it. So we came back 20 years later, when we both were married and had children on the way, and decided we needed one more adventure, and went back and finally reached Timbuktu.
Wow. And we don't have time to talk about it. But first of all, I found the book very, very entertaining, and you're obviously a very good writer.
Thank you.
Because it reads very well. I want to finish the rest of it, but there was one particular passage in here. You talked with a chief in one of the villages by the way, the country we were talking about is Guinea. You talked about with the chief about female circumcision, and because you noticed that. A lot of the women were cut.
Yes,
in the village.
In West Africa, and also particularly in places like Sudan or Ethiopia, the circumcision rate, if you want to use that term, I think it's really genital mutilation for women, is very, very high. I think in some place like Ethiopia, 9 out of 10 women are circumcised. I hesitate to use that word even, because I think it's much worse than a circumcision, actually.
And he was defending it. The chief in the village was saying that it was their custom, and you were saying it was a barbaric custom, but it's their custom. And what I also want to ask is, as human beings on this planet, is it something about us that we need to cut each other as a form of, I guess, a ritual or a custom? We have a lot of reasons in this country for male circumcision. There's a lot of reasons in other parts of the globe for female circumcision.
Right.
Is it something about initiation into the human species that we need to do this, or something, or something other than that?
Well, I think certainly I know that both male and female circumcision go back before both Islam and Christianity. They were around before the Old Testament, these procedures. I think it has its roots. They say that male circumcision goes back at least 5,000 years, perhaps up to 15,000 years, as a practice in culture. I think we are a violent animal, and initiation rites into being an adult used to be a very big part of culture, because that was procreation was continuing that tribe's life, and now we don't quite have that problem. In fact, I think it's kind of the reverse. And on the world right now, we've got probably too many people. But for most of mankind's history, just surviving was incredibly important, and so the initiation into the age at which you could procreate was a very big deal, and circumcision was part of that. In fact, in Africa, female and male circumcision is usually performed between the ages of 7 and 12, not as it's done here at a very early age.
All right, to be continued. All right, let's get to our phone calls here. We're talking with Mark Jenkins of Men's Health magazine. He wrote the cover story, "Did Circumcision Ruin Your Sex Life?" I urge you to pick it up on the newsstands. It's out there. And he's also the author of To Timbuktu, A Journey Down the Niger. That book is published by Morrow. All right, let's take our first phone calls for our guest, Mark Jenkins, Shelton Walden here in Walden's Pond. The number to call is 212-209-2900. 212-209-2900. Let's try this call here. WBAI, you're on the air. Hello?
Good afternoon, gentlemen.
Good afternoon. Who's this?
Well, I think it's not surprising that Men's Health is dealing with this issue. I think you're one of the finer men's magazines around. And I noticed that with a lot of your competition, with issues like this and others, they tend to be very patronizing to their main audience when it comes to men's health issues. And I think it's a credit to you and Jan Warner, who started the magazine. Why do you think that is?
Why men's magazines are patronizing, or?
Yeah, I find they're very patronizing when it comes to health issues, almost in a put-down sort of way that I never really understood. Your magazine isn't.
Right. Well, Men's Health does take a different approach. I think Men's Health is one of the first magazines to talk about men's health, literally, the sex aspects of health, the physical aspects, the nutritional aspects, honestly. For many, many years, I mean, guys were tough, right?
Yeah,
macho characters. That's the macho image still exists in our culture. Look at our heroes. They're all action heroes. Arnold Schwarzenegger, Mel Gibson, Clint Eastwood. So it's not surprising to me that you you feel as if they haven't talked to you squarely and honestly about health issues. But that's what Men's Health is trying to do.
Thank you.
Thank you. What do they say? No pain, no gain. You know,
Exactly.
Real macho ethic. WBAI, you're on the air. Hello? WBAI, you're on the air. Okay, 212-209-2900. Okay. WBAI, you're on the air. Hello?
Yes, hello. Good show. I have a couple of questions.
Yes, who's calling?
Jack.
Hi, Jack.
I wanted to find out the men that you interviewed that did decide later on in life to have the circumcision. What was their main reason for wanting to do this?
That's a good question. Thank you. Usually, it was some kind of surgical necessity, or their physicians in some way claimed that it was a surgical necessity. The men that I interviewed, most of whom were kind of upset about the fact that they are circumcised later in life. Some of them are now restoring because they feel like it was an injury to them. None of them seem to have chosen it just because they wanted to fit in. Almost all of them had some kind of, were at least told by their physicians that it was medically necessary.
I see. One or two other questions. I'll talk fast. And in regards to the enjoyment aspect of sex,
Right.
Are you saying that the enjoyment is dissipated because of circumcision? Or let me just a couple more things,
Sure.
and you can talk. Or is it ejaculation would be slower, quicker? You could have more times of ejaculation, length of time would increase, decrease, etc. Could you just elaborate on all of those subjects?
Sure. I'd be happy to, Jack.
Thank you for calling.
Do you want to hang up, or?
Yes, thank you.
Sure. I'd happy to talk about that. Uncircumcised men, this will become technical for those of you and perhaps somewhat graphic, so bear with me. Uncircumcised men, the glands of their penis are actually covered by the foreskin, and that keeps them sensitive. It keeps the glands sensitive, and thereby it's always moist, it's always, it's basically protected by the foreskin. Circumcised men, the glands are exposed all the time. They rub against the underwear. It dries up, and there actually is a medical term called keratination. It's hard to say, but that means basically you're developing calluses. The skin has become rough, and it's less sensitive. So sexually, uncircumcised men, the head of their penis is more sensitive than circumcised men. So that's where the enjoyment issue comes into. And basically, I did interview many men who felt that once they were circumcised, and they were circumcised as adults, that they lost sexual sensitivity, and that's what it's all about, isn't it?
Okay. Thank you, Jack, for calling. Very good question. WBAI, you're on the air. Hello, from Mark Jenkins.
Hello?
Yes, you're on the air.
Hi, Sheldon. It's Lori from Hudson Valley No Circle.
Yes, good afternoon. How are you doing?
Good. Thank you for that excellent article.
No problem, Laura. Thanks for calling.
A few things. First of all, the number for EarthSave, which, Sheldon, I didn't hear you give out,
Oh, yes.
is 914-732-7392. That's this Saturday at 6 o'clock at the Methodist Church in Pleasantville.
Yes, it's featuring Robert Cohen,
Right.
who is the author of Milk the Deadly Poison.
Exactly. Now, the other thing that you pointed out on your interview today is the fact that parents are given this information often not until after the birth of their child in the hospital.
That's true.
And I'd like to encourage, if there's anyone in the listening audience who now regrets having allowed their child to be circumcised, that they go back to their health practitioner, the doctor, the midwife, the childbirth educator, and let them know that they wish they had received accurate information during their prenatal visits. And I would like to know if either of you have any other suggestions in what we can do to make this happen more often, instead of the fact that the information is not given until the end.
Well, actually, there's one thing we can do right now, and that is give the web address for NoCirc.
Oh,
I have
yes.
that right here.
Sure.
It's www.nocirc.org.
Okay.
And for those of you who are out there listening, write that down. If you don't know much about circumcision, look it up. You'll find out a lot about it. There's also the Circumcision Resource Center. They've got their own websites, www.circumcision.org. All those are easy to remember. And both of them have phone numbers, too. Circumcision Resource Center is 617-523-0088, and NoCirc, at least on the West Coast, is 415-488-9883. So that's a start. Those of you who don't know much about it, get educated.
Okay.
The other one thing I'd like to add for couples who are involved in this decision before, once they're pregnant, is that often the woman is intimidated to discuss it because the husband gets angry and says, I'm fine, and we're doing it.
Right.
And I would just like to let women know that I speak to many mothers who regret this years, decades after they allowed it. And to not back off here, to get their information and hold firm, as I had to do with my son. But I have an intact child now, and I'm proud of it, although it was very hard to go through that uncomfortable part when you have a family who is not agreeing with you.
Laura, that's a good point. In fact, I also interviewed mothers who were disappointed that they'd had this done to their sons. I think that's basically when you know you're going to have a son, you should sit down and discuss this issue. Every set of couples should discuss this issue.
Okay.
And they should see a video and see the slides and see the pictures that are in Men's Health in August 98, because once the words don't describe exactly what happens.
It's true.
And once they've seen, when I saw a video, that's when I went public on this issue, because it was so strong that I knew I had to share that information.
Okay. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lori.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Sheldon.
Lori Evans. On WBAI 251, Shelton Walden here on Walden's Pond with Mark Jenkins of Men's Health. Go ahead.
Hello?
Yes.
I was inducted in the Army during the Second World War.
Mm-hmm.
And within a few months, I developed genital warts. Before I knew it, I was scheduled for an operation, and I had the circumcision done. I wonder what the state of knowledge about the lack of necessity for that way of dealing with the problem was at that time, and what, if any, claims I have against the U.S. Army for malpractice or whatever.
Well, they used to call them short arm inspections, I understand.
Yeah, that's right.
I wouldn't know what kind of claims you can have, although I don't know what the cures for genital warts during World War II were, although circumcision may or may not have cured genital warts, because genital warts can spread, and so just because you have the foreskin taken off doesn't mean that you could not develop genital warts someplace else on your penis or in the genital area. So that would not necessarily be a cure anyway. Whether or not you have some kind of claim against the government, I would be surprised. It was a long time ago. It was a very common procedure. Most men who weren't circumcised before they went into service ended up circumcised. So it'd be a tough fight.
But what was the state of knowledge about circumcision? Any idea?
Oh yeah, at that time, circumcision was considered a medical necessity. That it was good for hygiene. That it kept your penis cleaner. That's subsequently proved to not to be true, but at that time everyone believed in circumcision. The doctors believed in it. In fact, they believed in it right up until this very day. There are many doctors who still believe in the procedure.
So that was part of good medical practice.
That's right. It was considered appropriate.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for calling.
Right. Bye-bye.
As you mentioned, I was reading there's a very extensive history being done by Frederick Hodges on this issue. That you mentioned by black soldiers during World War II were subject even more so to this, because it was seen as more promiscuous, even more unclean during that time as well. WBAI, you're on the air. Hello?
Hi. My name's Anna from Queens.
Yes.
I tell you quite honestly, as a mother of two men, I can tell you there doesn't go by that I regret
I'm
having done that. They're 18 and 22 now. The knowledge of what I've done, I feel terrible. The society stigma against not doing it, even just 20 years.
I'm sorry, ma'am. Could you just speak up a little bit? I'm sorry.
The stigma of the society toward the people that don't do it. I mean, most men drop their pants, and the woman finds out that they haven't been circumcised, and they think he's a mutant or something. You know, I mean, it's an ugly thing.
Right.
In other words, these are the things that were taught. This, unfortunately, is a learning process that needs to change.
That's right.
You're correct.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you for calling, ma'am.
I'd never, if I could have them again, I would go through the labor pains all over again, just not to do it.
Thank you for calling.
Thank you, ma'am. Let's try a couple more calls here. It's 2:54 here on WBAI. You're on the air on Walden's Pond.
Hello, my name is Grant, and I'm from Manhattan.
Hi, Grant. How are you doing?
Yes, just fine. I found out about circumcision through WBLI, and I had my daughter. I had to talk to my daughter. She was having a baby, and I got her not to have her son circumcised. And one of the ways I did it, I bought a book for her, Say No to Circumcision, by Dr. Thomas J. Ritter.
Yes. Yes.
And it has 40 compelling reasons why you should respect his birthright and keep your son whole.
That's right.
And it convinced her, because kids have been known to die on the operating table from circumcision, I understand.
That has happened, and certainly mutilation has happened more frequently.
I understand also that Princess Di refused to have her boy circumcised.
Is that true?
Yeah, I heard that on
I-
WBLI also.
Yes, I believe that is true.
Yeah, and I can imagine the fight she must have went through with the royal family.
There was an enormous fight over that. On this
Yeah.
It's actually in a book
Uh-huh.
about the royal family. I forgot the Diana No One Knows.
Yes.
I think it's listed in there. It's documented in there. Yes.
Okay. Okay, thanks for everything, and keep up the good work.
Thank you,
Thanks for
sir.
calling.
Thank you, sir. All right, we're out of time, Mark. The time has gone by so quickly. First of all, I just want to say I want to congratulate you for a great piece.
Thank you.
I think everyone within the listening audience should go out and buy this magazine. It will definitely improve you and raise your IQ level about 30 points reading this article, because we need to be healthier people, and this definitely helps us to become healthier and more wholesome people. So I want to thank you.
Thanks a lot,
And
Sheldon.
thank the magazine for the courage of printing it too.
Yep.
You have any final thoughts before we go here?
I think, again, just people who are going to have a boy should look into the issue, study it, and you'll learn something. You'll find out that it's not medically necessary. It's just custom. Do you want to follow that custom, or do you want to set your own path?
Yeah. Mark Jenkins, thank you. Mark Jenkins is the author of the August 1998 edition of issue, the cover story, Did Circumcision Ruin Your Sex Life? He's also the author of To Timbuktu, A Journey Down the Niger, published by Morrow, and he's been my guest here on Walden's Pond this afternoon. We've been talking about the American phenomenon of circumcision.